too. Fat flakes of snow fell like silent, feathery ghosts in the windless, subarctic night beyond the window. Hamish Alexander stood watching them through thick, double-paned plastic, and felt the welcome heat of the fire against his back. His study was in the oldest part of Whitehaven, the sprawling Alexander family seat, and the walls of native stone were over 2 meters thick. Unlike some commodities, rock had been plentiful when Whitehaven was first built, and enough of it worked just as well as more esoteric off-world insulation would have. He turned back to the huge fireplace and added another log. He adjusted it with the poker, settling the native hemlock, which, in fact, bore very little resemblance to the old earth tree of the same name, into the bed of coals, then straightened and replaced the poker in its stand as he checked the wall clock again. It was 12 past comp, well into the 27-minute midnight hour, officially called compensate, that adjusted Manicore's 22.45-hour day to permit use of standard reckoning time units. And his eyebrow rose again. Even allowing for the time zone difference, it was unusual for his brother to screen him this late, and even more unusual for him to specify the exact time at which he would call. The comm terminal on his desk beeped as if to punctuate his thoughts, and he walked briskly over to answer it. He sat in the huge, padded chair his great-grandfather had commissioned from the craftsmen of the sandalwood system over a T-century before, and signaled acceptance of the call. The screen lit with his younger brother's face. "Hi, Amish, the Honorable William McLeish," Alexander said. "Hello, Willie." Alexander tipped the chair back and crossed his legs. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Your Commander Harrington," William replied, coming to the point even more quickly than usual. "My Commander Harrington." Alexander arched both eyebrows and William grinned from the screen. "Don't take that surprise tone with me, Amish. You've gloated enough over what she's been up to." "Gloat is such a crude word," Alexander protested. Then he grinned back. "Still, I suppose I have alluded to her achievements a time or two, and usually as rudely as possible when there's a liberal or progressive in the vicinity," William agreed. "A family trait, but just what was it you wanted to say about her?" "Actually, I'm acting in something of the role of an emissary from my esteemed Prime Minister." William's words remained light, but there was an undertone of seriousness in his voice. "Were you aware that Klaus Hoffman went out in person to browbeat her into backing off?" "No, I wasn't." Alexander made no effort to hide his disgust. "I suppose I should have expected it. I doubt he succeeded, though." "No, he didn't, but I'd like to know why you seem so confident he wouldn't have." "If Harrington were the sort to back down, she would have done it already. Besides, I've been peeking at Jim Webster's reports on a fairly regular basis. She couldn't be doing the job she is or raising this much general hell if she were stupid or hadn't thought the whole operation through ahead of time. That means she must have known what sort of reaction she was going to face before she decided to go ahead and step on the landmine." "Landmine's a pretty good word," William agreed with sudden, complete seriousness. "And if she had backed down, it might have blown up more than just her career." Alexander said nothing, but his eyes asked the question, and his brother shrugged. Before he went out, Hoffman hit every button he could reach back home at Landing. He didn't make much headway with the Duke, but he certainly bent Janicek's ear, and he called in his markers with Countess Nukiev and Sheridan Wallace's new men, too. "I think we've underestimated the contributions he's been making to certain parties' coffers, including the new men, but he definitely has his hooks even deeper into the liberals than we'd thought. Nukiev can't give a centimeter officially without breaking with the government and losing her post as Minister for Medusan Affairs. She's not about to do that, but it's pretty obvious she and Wallace were primed to come down on the Navy's entire handling of Basilisk Station. If Harrington had crumbled at this point, they would have been able to claim the Navy in her person had bungled and made the kingdom a galactic laughingstock by first creating interstellar incidents with her neighbors and then proving its irresolution by backing away from its duties under pressure." Alexander snorted contemptuously, and his brother gave a grim, wintry smile. "Of course, it would have all been gobbledygook. They've never complained about the situation on Basilisk Station before, and jumping on Harrington for going back to the status quo ante at the same time they criticized her for changing the status quo in the first place would be as stupid as it would be illogical. On the other hand, the liberals have never been noted for the logic with which they approach Basilisk, have they? And if they talked fast enough and loud enough, they could probably engender enough confusion That would do them, Alexander growled. Depends on how they did it, Amish, William warmed soberly, and on who they got to help them do it. For instance, it looks like High Ridge was ready to support at least their initial motives. High Ridge was throwing in with Nukiyev and Wallace. That's a switch, Alexander observed. And not one that bodes well for the Conservative Association's continued support for the Duke, William agreed. I suppose that was Janicek and North Hollow more than anyone else. Harrington's making that ass young, and by implication Janicek himself, look worse every day. But the point is that all the opposition parties have been riding their rank and file pretty hard to prep them for some big move. Once Hoffman bullied Harrington into backing down, and Wallace was going to play the hatchet man. He even went as far as to put his name down and the state of affairs on Basilisk Station on the list of next month's official questions. Oh, Alexander shook his head with a small smile. The official questions left gave the opposition a way to force the government to allow open and generally partisan discussions of things it might prefer to avoid. A prime minister could refuse to answer an official question only if he certified with the backing of the crown and the chief justice of the Queen's bench that answering it would jeopardize the kingdom's security. Even then, the government had no choice but to permit individual members of parliament to debate the question in secret session. Potentially, that made the list an extremely effective parliamentary weapon, but it was a double-edged sword, and the timing could go wrong, like now. Under the unwritten portion of the Manticoran constitutional tradition, a question cannot be withdrawn, even by its author, once it was on the list. Clumsy, he murmured thoughtfully. Absolutely. Since he can't withdraw it now, Harrington's given us the perfect shot to ram through amendments to the original act of annexation. But that's only true if she's still senior officer on the station when the question comes up. Well, I know Jim certainly doesn't plan to pull her, and Janice said can't if Jim and Lucy and Cortez stand firm. I think they will. And if Young gets himself back on station. Now that, Alexander admitted, is a more ticklish point. Jim and Lucian can't stop him from going back out any more than Janice can believe Harrington, not unless they want to come out into the open and declare war on the Conservatives. And if it comes to an open showdown between them and the First Lord, they'll lose. They have to, or the whole concept of civilian control of the military goes out of the airlock. That's what I was afraid of, William sighed. Our spies in the enemy camp suggest that High Ridge is pressuring North Hollow to suggest his son bite the bullet and go back without his ship if he has to. Won't work, Alexander said firmly. In a sense, he was senior officer in Basilisk only because his ship was assigned there, and he went with her. What do you mean? William looked puzzled, and his brother's grin was wicked. That's always been one of the problems with the picket there, Willie. You see, officially, there is no Basilisk Station to command, not in the sense that there's a Manticore Fleet District or Griffin Fleet District, thanks to the act of annexation and Janicek's own policies. That means the picket senior officer isn't in the same position as, say, a squadron commander. In the case of a squadron or an official station or district, a commanding officer is responsible for all operations in his designated command area and for every ship assigned to it. But thanks to the mishmash we've actually got in Basilisk, where there's no formally specified command area at all, Young's primary responsibility was to act as captain of his own heavy cruiser. It was only the fact that he was the senior RMN officer present that made him the picket commander, or, to put it another way, Warlock is his designated command area, and his authority behind her hull is restricted by her current physical location and functions on a strictly ad hoc basis. Oh, if he detached himself from Warlock to Fearless in the first place, the Admiralty wouldn't have objected. In fact, that's what he ought to have done. But when he officially delegated the senior officer's job to Harrington by removing his ship from the picket, he released himself unilaterally from any responsibility for or authority over Basilisk Station until his refit is completed. Technically, he can't go back without Warlock. He can't go back without Warlock without absenting himself from his post unless Lucian cuts him orders to that effect. I can't quite see Lucian doing that. Warlock back from the yard? William asked anxiously. Can he get back up there with his ship before Wallace's question comes up? He might. Alexander sat back and drummed on the desk blotter with the fingers of both hands. He thought for several seconds, then shook his head. He just might at that. All right. William drew a deep breath. You understand, of course, that this has to be completely unofficial, Hamish. Alexander nodded, already guessing what was coming next. The Duke has asked me to tell you that Her Majesty's government would find it most convenient if Lord Papel Young is not on Basilisk Station for the next month. I understand, Willie. Alexander gazed at his brother for a few more seconds, then shrugged. I'll see what I can do. Unofficially, of course. Thanks, Hamish. We appreciate it. Anything for a good cause, Willie, Alexander said. See you later. His brother nodded, and Alexander cut the circuit. He sat in pensive thought for a moment, and then punched a scramble-coded number into the column. The screen lit with a wait prompt, then cleared to show a sleep-tousled James Webster, who, oh, for God's sakes, Hamish, can't you let a working man sleep? Afraid not. I just got off the screen with Willie, and he's got a little job for us. Alexander outlined his conversation with his brother in a few short sentences, and Webster's eyes widened while the last vestiges of sleep faded from them. Don't want much, do they? He asked sardonically when Alexander finished. No more than we do. This sounds like the perfect opportunity to catch the opposition with its shorts around its ankles, Jim. From what Willie's told me in the past, a pretty firm majority of the Lords is impressed enough by Harrington's accomplishments to stand with the government. And we already had a strong majority in the Commons. If Wallace has to ask his question while she's still acting senior officer, the government can respond using her policies as its basis, not Young's, and make her look like exactly what she is, a decisive officer fully discharging the Navy's responsibilities for the first time in 20 years. And they can argue that what's needed is to see to it that other officers are in a position to do the same thing in the future. If that happens, we can actually turn Basilisk Station into something that works instead of a half-assed nightmare. Harrington's done her part for us. All we have to do is keep Young here in Manticore and offer her back a little longer. Hamish, I'll be the first to admit I dream about a chance like this, but just how do you propose to pull that off? I can guarantee Lucian won't give him permission to quit his ship, and that I won't let him go back without her, but Warlock can't be all that far from completing a refit. I know, but you know, Jim, even the best refit crews can fall off their stride from time to time. I don't think this is something the First Base Lord should know about. In that case, don't tell him. Alexander flashed a sudden boyish grin. Don't tell me you don't sometimes forget to mention things to your official persona. It's been known to happen from time to time, Webster allowed. What won't I be telling myself this time? I'm going to go up and have a little talk with Craig, I think. Can I tell him that you've blessed my mission? Unofficially, of course. Unofficially, but fervently, Webster agreed. Good. Thanks, Jim. Sorry to have dragged you out of bed. Don't worry about it. Just go do a good job on Craig. Oh, I will, Alexander agreed with a smile. I will. Vice Admiral of the Red, Sir Craig Warner, commanding officer of Her Majesty's Space Station of Festus, stole the time from his schedule to meet the private yacht personally. Longer ago than he liked to remember, a very young Commander Warner had found himself embroiled in a duel over a drunken insult to the good name of a lady. His captain at the time, a most well-born nobleman, had disapproved rather strongly of the practice of dueling, but when the circumstances and graphic nature of the insult had been explained to him, he had astounded Commander Warner by offering to act as a second. The lady in question was now married to Vice Admiral Warner and the mother of his 4 children, and his then captain had become a very close friend and godfather to Warner's oldest son. So when Hamish Alexander asked for a few hours of his time, Warner was only too happy to oblige. Now the yacht completed its docking maneuver, and Warner stepped up to the personnel tube to greet his visitor. It was an unofficial visit, and Alexander was in civilian dress. He'd been on half-pay since the first week Sir Edward Janicek took over the Admiralty, so no formal courtesies intruded. Good to see you again, Craig, Alexander said, shaking his hand firmly, about ready for a real space-going command again. They also serve who stand in well months here first, unfortunately. Buships likes me more than I like them to. It's because you're so damned efficient, Alexander teased as they headed for the personnel capsules. True, too true. But what can I do for you, Hamish? Want a tour of my little workshop? Maybe later. In fact, I'm sure I would later. But first, I need to bend your ear for a few minutes in private. Warner shot his superior a very sharp look indeed, then shrugged and waved him to the capsule. In that case, let's take this to my office, he suggested, punching buttons, and Alexander nodded. The capsule deposited them at a terminal less than 50 meters from Warner's office, and the two admirals walked down the passage side by side, chatting amiably and harmlessly. Warner's aide and personal yeoman were waiting, but their boss shooed them out and closed the hatch firmly behind them. Then he gestured Alexander into a comfortable chair, poured drinks, and sat down behind his desk. And now, he said, what's all this unofficial visit about, Hamish? It's about Basilisk Station, Alexander replied, and Warner blinked in surprise. More specifically, it's about the possibility of finally getting our hands untied there. Interested? Very, but where do I come in? Well, Craig, it's like this. Alexander leaned back to cross his legs and reported his conversation with his brother yet again. Warner listened intently, nodding his understanding of each point, then tipped back his own chair. So you and Admiral Webster want me to hang Young out to dry, he said when Alexander was done. More or less, and very unofficially. How about it? Can you swing it for us? I don't know, Hamish. Warner plucked at his lower lip, frowning in thought, then shrugged. The thing is, I have to admit I've already been dragging my heels ever since word of Harrington's activities started getting around, just to watch the little bastard squirm. He hasn't been getting the work priorities he thinks he should, and he's been in here every other day or so to complain. Does that mean you've used up all your tricks? I don't know. Warner thought some more, then turned to his terminal and punched up the work files on HMS Warlock. He frowned at them, whistling tunelessly between his teeth as he paged through the screens of data, and Alexander possessed himself in all the patience he could manage. Well now, Warner murmured after several minutes, that's interesting. What? When Warlock first arrived, Young wanted a complete overhaul of her Ford Warsharsky tuners. In fact, he was pretty strident about it. But as you know, Buships, meaning me in this instance, has to sign off on anything that big. He looked up with a wicked grin, and Alexander smiled back with suddenly dancing eyes. And what was your decision, Admiral Warner? I didn't give him one, Admiral Alexander. From what I can see here, he's good for another 8 to 10 months hyper time on the tuners he's got before he even approaches mandatory replacement wear. I refused to give him an answer mainly just to be a pain in his arrogant ass, but I doubt I'd authorize it under normal circumstances with that much time left on the component. But under these circumstances, why, I think I might just find it in my heart to okay the work after all, Warner said generously. Good, but will he bite, do you think? I thought you said he's been in here trying to get you to expedite. Oh, he has. And I'm almost certain he'll say no thank you if I make him an offer at this point. But there are ways, Hamish, there are ways. Such as? Well, Warner switched off his terminal and turned back to his friend. I think the first step will be to hold the good news that I've decided to authorize his requested work until the end of this watch. Young's been spending a lot of time dirtside, hitting the landing night spots while Commander Tankersley, his exec, does all the work. No love lost there, by the way. And while he's out bar crawling, he leaves his comlink home and lets his message service handle any calls. So if we give him time to clear out, then authorize the work, we'll have a full watch and a half, 10 hours minimum to hit our stride before he comes back. I imagine we'll have his Warsharsky sales spread all over the slip before he knows a thing about it. Tankersley won't smell a rat and warn him. As I said, there's no love lost between the two of them. Tankersley's a fairly decent sort. I don't think Young's attempt to shaft Harrington sits very well with him, and you can't be exec to a man like Young without getting to know exactly how useless he really is. Under the circumstances, I sort of doubt Young's explained his real motives to him either, so Tankersley can play the uninformed but earnest exec to the hilt if he wants to. I imagine he'll screen Young all right, but probably only to leave a message with his service, and not one with any special priority. Warner tapped lightly on his desk for a moment, then nodded to himself. Won't hurt to make sure, though. By age, not just good looking. She's a very bright young woman, and she's been spending some off-duty time with Tankersley. That's one reason I figured he must be alright. Cindy wouldn't waste her time on him if he wasn't. Would it be alright if I ever mentioned him that I'd appreciate his keeping his next progress report to Young a little vague? We can't involve Jim or the government, gritting, Alexander warned. If you're wrong about him, you'll be the one who comes back to haunt. I don't think I am wrong, and I'm perfectly willing to run the risk for something like this. Hell, who needs a battle squadron? Carol would rather have me plant aside for good anyway. Warner spoke lightly, though both of them knew that loss of his next command, or even half pay, was not merely possible, but probable if any of this became official knowledge. Their eyes met for a moment, and then Warner smiled. Don't sweat it, Hamish, I'll pull it off, and once we get Warlock's forward hull opened, I can guarantee she won't leave Dot for a good 7 weeks. Long enough, Alexander agreed, and thanks. Don't mention it. I never liked his father evil, either, and Carol will be delighted when she hears about this. North Hollow was after her before we were married, you know. No, I didn't. I wondered why you were so ready to dislike his son, though. Hell, that ancient history didn't have anything to do with that. Well, not much. This little creep is a disgrace to his uniform all on his own. Warner sat for a moment longer, running through his plans, then nodded and stood. Well, that's that, he said with undisguised satisfaction. And now, while I wait to put my nefarious plan into effect, why don't I give you that tour? Then we can finish up with a supper in the Flag's officers' mess before you head back home. Sounds good to me, Alexander agreed, and the two admirals headed for the office hatch once more. By the way, how are the kids? He asked as they stepped through it. I saw Carol last week, but we didn't have time to talk. Oh, they're fine. Sandra just made commander, and it looks like Bob's got a shot at the ATC early. Keith and Fred are still in school, of course, and neither of them seems interested in the Navy, but they walked down the passageway, chatting cheerfully.